3, 2, 1. Alexander Robbins. Hello, sir.
Hi, Lauren. How's it going?
Oh, it's so nice to have my buddy Alex from Blue Maid on the Ponytail show because you know everything about everything, and I'm excited to talk to you today about linen and about the aesthetics of worn clothing because
Well,
that's
that's
the
very
thing.
flattering because I only know about linen and the aesthetics of clothing.
Well, I'm glad I have you on for that then because yeah, that would be a disaster if you didn't know anything about it. But for
Yes.
folks out there who don't know who you are, I'm just going to give them a little rundown. So, Alex, you are one half of Blue Maid, that's an independent brand from New York who make beautiful things from linen, all the linens. And I met you a few years ago now in New York at a trade show, and yeah, we seem to have quite a few friends in common, and we just hit it off like Crash Bandicoot and pals.
That was exactly the video game reference I was going to go for.
Yeah, I thought so. Thank you for knowing that was I grew up on PlayStation 1, and that was one of the weird obscure video games that my sister and I used to play, Crash Team Racing, which was basically Mario Kart but Crash Bandicoot.
But actually not as good, right?
But better. Not
Oh,
as
better.
good,
Whoops,
better.
sorry. Better. I meant better.
So yeah, do you want to expound on Blue Maid and what you're about?
Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, you gave a great description. So I'm one half. I and my wife, we started Blue Maid, and a lot of it had to do with trying to find increasingly better textiles in a both as consumers and then as designers, because we just were not seeing them out on the market. And our search for better and better textiles definitely led us to linen, and then trying to find what the best type of linen is. And once we opened up that, Pandora's box, we've never gone back, because linen is just such an amazing fabric with all of these properties of breathing well, being hypoallergenic, just feeling amazing. And it has this wonderful history. It's also, as a maker, it has this wonderful structural functionality, so you can do a lot with it. Anyway, we just, once we started to realize the options there, we never turned back. And I will say, even personally now, I have a hard time not wearing linen on a daily basis. It's almost like my skin craves the feeling of it. So all of this combines to being we wanted to create a brand that gave us the freedom and the ability to find the best kind of textiles, to make the kind of clothing we would want to wear out of those textiles, and keep it as simple as that.
Yeah.
Good ingredients, simple cuts, and just the joy of having a fabulous textile next to your body.
Yeah. Isn't that such a formula for all good things in life? It's good ingredients, good makings, and then it's good things in life are not too complicated, in my opinion, but there's so much riffraff out there that it's hard to weed out the riffraff and really focus on beautiful, good things. My experience with linen, it really comes from 19th century French linen workwear pieces, having lived in France and digging a lot in France and all around Europe. Definitely those beautiful linen aprons and linen bedwear and linen workwear, even German World War II rucksacks with that hardy kind of linen blend, plain weave fabrics that they're constructed in. Linen has such a beautiful texture and quality to it. Which brings me to Belgium, because I know that you source a lot of your linen mainly from Belgium, which seems to be the birthplace of linen, at least for the region of Europe that is like France, Belgium. But yeah, we went on a little road trip up to Kortrijk. Is that what it was called? Kortrijk?
Yeah, absolutely. Kojak.
Yeah. Which was like kind of like the birthplace of linen. We drove up to like the very northern part of France, and we crossed the border over to Belgium, and that was where we found all the linen fields and the linen museum, and we ate linen cheese or flax
It's
cheese.
true. It's so true.
That wasn't
And
your first trip. Like, so tell me like how you kind of boiled down you kind of hunted down the best linen, and what brought you to Belgium.
absolutely. So linen comes from the flax plant, and actually flax, it can be grown in lots of different climates all over the world and has been growing across Europe for centuries and centuries. There's ample evidence that Alexander the Great's army made their armor out of linen, and this was very convenient because you could muster a bunch of farmers from across Europe to go fight in Persia with you, and they could make their own armor by weaving the linen and then gluing it together with rabbit glue, and it was strong enough to block an arrow at that period in history.
Whoa.
But that's just to say it was abundant, so you can grow it very easily, you can grow it very quickly. And it grows very quickly. It grows in about 3 months, and then you have to process. Yeah, so it's a very short and.
That's
go ahead.
Sorry, I'm gonna cut in. That's actually surprising, because I know hemp takes about 3 months to grow as well, but I wasn't aware that linen was that fast too.
And they're cousins in a sense. So they're part of the same type of plant family that creates a bast fiber. So these are all fibers that come from the stalk of a plant. So hemp, flax, and ramie is another important one in Asia. And all of them require a similar form of processing where you have to break down the stalk by fermenting it or putting it in water in a way that it just starts to loosen up and turn into these hair-like fibers. And over the history of this, it was found out that certain climates make straighter, stronger, better hair-like fibers. And the best climate for that was places along the Gulf Stream. So Northern Ireland, as the wind's coming across the Atlantic, and then into what was historically Flanders, but which is now Belgium, part of the Netherlands, and France. That sort of area where the Atlantic winds just come in, created the best, tallest, strongest, straightest types of fibers, which then, when it's taller, longer, straighter, makes it so much easier to weave. It makes it for a tighter weave. So for centuries, because of this environmental condition, Belgium, or should we say Flanders, became the place to get the finest of linen. Even though you could get linen in other places, probably one of the biggest other producing were formerly Russian states, so Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, major linen production, but never historically at the same level of quality as what was being produced in Belgium.
Interesting.
And that continues to today.
Yeah. I've seen linens from all three of those areas that you talked about, Ireland, Belgium, France, and like Poland, and they all have very different qualities about them, definitely. Irish linen is beautiful as well. Like, it's very expensive, Irish linen, I must say. That's probably more to do with a labor cost issue. But yeah, for sure, the French Belgian linens that I've come across we went to see one of the factories, and they do have a very distinct difference if you're going to get real nerdy about the fabrics.
Yeah.
I'm just judging that based on my the hand feels of the fabric, because I don't I wouldn't be knowledgeable enough to go into the real micro like microscopic levels of the difference of the fibers. But I know you do. You have like a special little instrument
Yeah,
that you like to use when you go see your fabric suppliers. Tell us
it's
about that.
true. So yeah, Lauren is talking about what is called a linen scope, and it can be used for any fabric, but it comes from investigating linen fibers, and it really is just a magnifying glass with a light on it, so you can get really close and see how the individual fibers have been twisted in the yarn, to see the underlying kinkiness, to see the general sort of especially if there's like flyaways happening in the yarn, to see if it was spun correctly. So yeah, I am happy to get into the nitty gritty of the nerdiness, and then also the chemistry of how the things are grown. But I think when we sort of talk about quality in general, whatever we find as our final product, if we're talking about linen, we could also be talking about cotton. Generally, if someone's cutting corners in the process, it reveals itself in the end product. We might not always be sensitive to know where the corner was cut, but you generally know when you're like wearing a t-shirt that doesn't feel half as good as the t-shirts you had when you were a kid. Or when this linen is itchy, but you've been told that linen is such a great fabric. And corners can be cut at lots of different ways in that process. So they can be cut in the original growing of it. They can be cut in the processing of the cut fiber, then the weaving and the sewing. And so I think when speaking back to those sort of regional differences, some of that is not a difference at the level of the growing of the flax, which would actually be quite similar. But you can actually have different styles in terms of the weaving. So the Irish weaving style is demonstrably different than the Flemish weaving style. And then Italy is also an important player in the sort of general market, but they don't grow very much linen at all. They import almost all the linen from Flanders, but their weaving style is just so much finer. So it's like, and when you imagine like a man on a yacht wearing a thin white linen shirt, that's the kind
like
of
that finesse.
Exactly. Where the Belgians are doing things like you were sort of talking about, like they still do have a lot of the mills there have military contracts. So they make cots and backpacks that are of this sort of
and
wonderful
upholstery.
Yeah, and upholstery grade. A lot of upholstery grade. And heavier, say, bed linens also out of that. And then Ireland goes even one step towards the more textured in how they weave. And this is to say, all of these are often using really well grown, well woven. It's just a different flavor on how they do them. Personally, and the way that our company has tended to design, we've gone for that middle between the really fine Italian and the really coarse Irish. We've gone for sort of this happy medium of what you get in the Flemish, so northern France and southern Belgium. It feels closer to, I think, what a lot of cotton canvas weights we're familiar with. But it's not. It has all these other amazing properties, and it has this great durability, and it changes over time, and it breaks in and conforms to your body in these really beautiful ways.
I definitely associate the linens that you're using with more work shirts, workwear. It's got more of a beautiful rustic feel to it, but not too rustic either, because then you'll end up with unwearable, very hard to wear pieces. You've found that really nice medium in between, which gives your pieces so much character, and that's why I love your pieces. Like what you're wearing today. What are you wearing today, actually? Tell me about that.
So like I'm saying, I'm so engrossed into linen that it feels weird not to get dressed with linen. So I'm wearing a linen undershirt from the Russian military. So this is a vintage piece. And a lot of European and Russian militaries still do undershirts out of linen. They're great because they're moisture wicking. So if you sweat, it dispels it, whereas cotton just absorbs and holds onto it. So I love this shirt. And then the outer shirt is a shirt that we designed. I have to move my technology, my microphone. Hold on a sec. Let me hope this won't affect the sound. So this is an early piece that we designed in, I believe, our 2017 collection. So it's really based off of an old agricultural smock.
Mm,
So especially Belgian laborers would have had a linen shirt that could have gone over their clothing as a protection because linen is incredibly durable. It was the material used for ship sails for most of the period of European exploration.
mm.
And it also gets stronger when it's wet. But this would be a pretty standard boxy cut with that you wear oversized to protect yourself when you're out in the field. But I just love oversized
Yeah,
clothes. So like it felt, even though it has its old functional need, it felt very easy to transition it to wearing in today. And
yeah.
it's just such an easy layering piece. Um, and
And
this
your hat.
particular,
Oh,
oh, and
sorry.
my hat. So then this has been something that has been a recurrent thing pretty much every season now for us. An all linen baseball cap, which is really just as simple as it comes in terms of linen is breathable, linen is light, and that's exactly what you want in the baseball cap. And we wanted to make sure it was just that, so we don't put any plastic or cardboard into
Mm,
the brim. It's just all fabric, and just it's like we were talking about before. I don't think we need to do much to improve on this,
yeah,
and so I've been wearing this now for 3 years or so, and I love, how it feels right on my head. It just slips
yeah.
right on.
I love the
If I
length of
have
the
to,
brim.
oh yeah. So I
It's
mean,
a nice length.
there's a vintage reference going on
Yeah.
there, um, and I think about old fishing hats and the Americana surrounding the transition from baseball hats to sort of sportsman hats. So those were in the background as we were
Mm,
deciding on these, and this is, the tricky part about design. While things are simple, you still have to make a ton of decisions.
yeah.
And to maintain the simplicity often requires a lot of work. Um, but yeah, but definitely Americana vintage references were a big part of this. And then there's some,
That long brim actually reminds me of the that heritage, the Quaker caps. I don't know if you've ever seen them before, but the Quaker
absolutely.
caps have really long brims, and like that's what make them really unique. But that the length of your cap is kind of in between like a classic baseball cap and the Quaker, which I like a lot.
And it was, that's one of the main factors. Like we my inclination is actually to go longer, but my better half, Lily, my co-designer and co-partner and everything, she's like, you would never wear that down the street. But
What? Really?
she's right. I think
That's true.
we're always looking for that balance between something, and it's a delicate balance between vintage as costume and vintage as something usable for
Mm,
today.
yeah. It's like you
And
guys are like yin and yang. The two of
yeah,
you
but
make harmony, make good decisions.
exactly. Ta-da.
Yeah.
In the form of linen caps. But
Yeah.
this has been a really successful piece for us. It's gotten a lot of press. It got picked up by the New York Times. Uh,
Amazing.
yeah, so and we just try to keep it as pure as possible. Good linen, simple cut, done.
Yeah. That's all you need. Beautiful. Well, that's a nice transition now, talking about linen to the aesthetics of worn clothing, because they do definitely have a long time relationship together. And like coming from looking at like vintage and looking at beautiful old linen pieces, linen workwear, worn, falling apart linen that's been repaired by hand and darned, and that is the beautiful aesthetic that I find about linen products. And I think you can talk about this a lot because I'm sure that's what made you fall in love with linen as well.
Yeah, I definitely. I think the first pieces that really caught my eye were, really old, previously worn, weathered in some way linen. And I really have always been attracted to the very narrowly woven French linens. So they were probably done on a loom that
Hand
fit
looms.
exactly a basic hand loom. And the interior designer Axel Vervoet often will take those and he'll use them to upholster couches and chairs, but he'll use the narrowness so that the seam where the two hand woven pieces come together runs right through the middle of the chair. So it's very overt. And something about just referencing that, this history of making, this roughness in the hand, and then bringing that into this new context was, it
So
just always
beautiful.
felt
Yeah.
incredibly beautiful. And so my wife and I, we started collecting our own scraps of old linen, which in the States is much harder to find. It's easier to get in Europe, and then weirdly, even easier to get in Japan because there's been an interest
Yeah.
in collecting textiles. So we did what we could at like rummage sales and thrift stores here in the US, and just started accumulating more and more older pieces of linen, tablecloths, pillowcases, very rarely clothing in the United States. They're mostly these home goods. But you could find 19th century pieces, sometimes that they were stained, but sometimes that stain itself was part of the appeal.
Yeah.
And like you mentioned, repairs. Repairs have always had this like fascination for me, and I think for many people.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of interest. There's been books and museum exhibitions on Japanese boro, of the creating of cloth through rags, which I'm very happy to talk about and could talk about
Yeah.
ad
Let's just
nauseum.
quickly explain to folks out there in a little bit more detail what boro is. I mean, yeah, it definitely is creating cloth from rags, but just to describe what some boro pieces might look like, you might be looking at a beautiful indigo, an indigo jacket that might be completely looking like patchwork of tattered, kind of like almost completely corroded bits of fabric on top of each other, layered and hand sewn together, and just one beautiful kind of patchwork piece of like time and effort made from like discards that's been made into something that looks like a piece of art.
And it looks like a piece of art in a couple of different ways. It looks like a well constructed garment, but it also looks like an abstract geometric composition because there's often contrasting patterns. So you might have had a striped piece of rag going up against a very deep indigo rag next to one that might have a different traditional motif on it. And that's all kind of quilted together, not quilted in the process of like putting batting, but, laid out as a field of fabric. So it has a conversation even with like the history of abstract painting, the way we talk about composition and form. There's just so much going on in your average piece of boro. And what's amazing though is they're not constructed like, an abstract painter who would be a good example, like an Ellsworth Kelly series of colored patches or something, where he sat down to do that. Instead, boro was like often created by multiple people over multiple years without something like a plan. It's kind of like a multi-generational unconscious composition. And the result of that has this extra magnetism and quality that I've always been attracted to.
It's almost like the result of a collective consciousness, like a collective, like a group, like this kind of energy flow of a group of people rather than like just the intention of one individual, which is much more beautiful. It's very poetic in a way.
It's very poetic. And I think though it's also worthwhile pausing and also acknowledging that these are human artifacts not born out of aesthetic leisure or the leisure to make aesthetic objects, but they were really born out of poverty. and they're out of a context of necessity of making do with what you have. So, even the thread that often binds these pieces together is just thread individually pieced apart from other rags.
Mm.
And the amount of extra time and labor that had to go into creating these, it's complicated, or I feel weird about it, right? Because we're reveling in the work of the most abject poor, especially in like 19th and early 20th century Japan, uh, without necessarily acknowledging that.
Yeah, I think history, the context definitely always needs to be acknowledged. But I feel like that comes from also a lineage of, like, I can draw so many parallels between the culture of Boro from Japan that came from poverty, that was definitely utilized during a very poor time period. But that comes from, you know, China. It comes from like ethnic minority groups in China. It appears, this principle appears all through Southeast Asia, minority groups in Southeast Asia, which is, I'm a collector of Southeast Asian textiles, and I can tell you, like, there are so many pieces that have been woven, usually are woven for marriage, woven for death, woven over the period of many years. And you can see that, like, every natural resource has been utilized throughout the year, the changing seasons. There's nothing that goes to waste, and there is like such a beautiful, unintentional but intentional process that happens. So I feel like, yes, maybe, yeah, for sure, we have to always acknowledge history and context. That's like the main thing. But Boro came from somewhere. Like, it didn't just
Yes.
pop up in thin air.
And perhaps it belies a sort of truism about textiles, which is textiles generally hide their context very well because they're a very durable, movable kind of material. So they can move place, they can exist through time in a ways where their specific contexts drift away, and what you're left with is just the actual material. And there's very few things. It's like textiles and paper are like these
Yeah.
amazing technological human inventions that do that.
Yeah.
And persist beyond our mortal
Yeah.
selves.
Absolutely. In my collection of Southeast Asian textiles, textiles are definitely used to pass down history, pass down stories, teach lessons, to adorn, to celebrate marriage and death, to show us what dye colors, exist in nature, in different parts of the world in different times of the year. They also show us, I have like a beautiful piece from Laos, a monk piece, that's fringed with cocoons, like little cocoon, there's fringing with beautiful little cocoons. And on that piece, the colors change very often because of the different, seasons that the dye colors were available. So, like, yeah, textiles have so much, we're talking about cultures who have no written language. So, things are passed down through, cooking, song, storytelling, textiles, and textiles are so important,
But I think there's something cultural too about being able to read those textiles. So I know there are. All the examples that you gave are perfect for cultures that can use textiles to reference its own history. But I think and by we, I'm sort of talking about the globalized world of advanced capitalism where we live in. We specifically don't read textiles that way, and maybe we could, or maybe that is just too. The entire industry of fast fashion is based on not being able to read the origin of where any of that textile or fiber has come from, and that it's merely just a sort of a costume reproduction of what might have been on the runway that season. So the sort of illegibility of textiles, I think, is also a major function in our world. And I think it would be a very different and interesting planet if we all did read textiles
Yeah, I think
in that
so.
deeper way.
Yeah, I mean, this happened with food in like the early 2000s where the food industry drastically transformed and became much more transparent because we started to ask questions about where our food was coming from. I had hope for this, for the textile, for the fashion industry, like, especially like after the financial crisis in 2008, there was like a lot of hope that, like, there were a lot of beautiful brands popping up, very much heritage focused, brands, and they continued to grow, but fast fashion just has grown so much faster and at such a tidal wave, like,
Yeah.
I've heard something crazy. Don't quote me on this, anyone, but like something like, back in 2005, fast fashion brands were creating something like 6 collections a year, or maybe 4 to 6 collections a year, and now they're producing like up to 15 collections in one year. It's like, if you think about that in the
Well,
span of time, it's ridiculous.
it depends on how you want to even define a collection. Certain businesses will have weekly deliveries. So you could have
Yeah.
as many as
Jeez.
52 different design sequences within a
Oh
whole
man.
year. So, but back to your analogy of the sort of slow food movement and agriculture, I think it's a really useful analogy, but that it kind of hits a limit at the uh, at the level of, say, agricultural production. That fast food was really able to get going because so many small farmers who were doing husbandry or doing the fruit and veg, they could link up with chefs in this very intimate way, and the scale was manageable and human. But really, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, certainly since the middle of the 19th century, textiles has been dominated by cotton, and cotton has been massively industrialized.
Yes.
And there isn't a clear path for how you get your small batch cotton farmer. So even if you have designers with the best of intentions, when they start going down the supply chain, eventually they're going to bump up against a large multinational conglomerate that's
Yeah.
either growing massive fields of cotton in India or Central Asia, or massive weaving operations who are vertically integrated with those farms. So the sort of open space for a new kind of more human-sized working has never really been able to manifest in the textile world. And it's unclear what it would take to really make that viable and sustainable. Back to linen, because I like to talk
Yes.
about linen. Linen has never truly been industrialized, so that was one of the things that inclined us to it. To get the really straight fibers that are preferential for making linen garments, you have to plant them incredibly close together. And you'll remember when we went to go see those flax fields, it's just like a dense grass.
Yeah.
And what that means is the only way to cultivate them, because you need the entire fiber that goes from the roots all the way to the top of the stalk, is really through hand cultivation. You still have to pull them out of the ground, and then you have to lay them out horizontally so that dew will help break down the fibers. So it requires a lot of hand labor, which can't be industrialized easily or quickly. And then it requires a massive amount of water and space. To really industrialize that on that scale would mean, if you can grow a 1 acre of vertical or flax, and then you have to lay it out horizontally, it just increases the number of acres you need per unit just like exponentially. So that has always been a physical material limit on how much flax can ever be grown really on the planet, because again, there's only these select climates where it's doable, and it has to share that with sheep for wool and other farms. And so it's
Yeah.
always been this smaller agricultural thing. Now, that isn't to say that there hasn't been issues in the history of linen and that linen hasn't been free from labor abuses. But I think we can safely say, unlike cotton, it was never a major part of the slave trade. It was never, it isn't a current part of child labor like we see going on in the Central Asian republics, where there's a lot of children being used for pulling cotton. So it's not because I think linen is necessarily more virtuous, but there's something practical, or there's some practical limitations built into the materiality of flax and its cultivation that have just kept it as a more
Yeah.
humane, reasonably sized kind of commodity.
I think there's like a definite kind of strong moral to that story is like yet definitely focusing on small batch, moving forward to kind of have a more sustainable looking future. I hate that word sustainable, but it's the word I'm going to use right now.
Go with it.
Yeah, like we can't continue to be doing things on such an immense scale that we are doing right now. And I think talking about cotton is a really important one because, cotton, even you talked about the slave trade in America, and we can also talk about just quickly the British and what they did in India, basically exporting cotton at such a cheap rate from India and exporting it back into the UK, where they were spinning and weaving it into beautiful cloth, and therefore India's economy was suffering. The people of India were suffering because their big commodity was being exported and woven offshore, and so none of the money was kind of circulating in there. And that's why Gandhi started the Khadi movement, which was a cottage industries movement to keep cotton the cotton, the whole process from growing to finished woven fabric within India, using cottage industries. But then again, that's another case of keeping it small and like building business and community on this kind of very small scale to kind of to be more of a sustainable way for people to live and eat and earn money and feed their kids. And I think there's also a lot of parallels between the properties, this kind of the limitations of linen in that sense with hemp as well, but maybe hemp for a little bit of a different reason because of the taboo kind of properties that hemp has often been mistaken for. Industrial hemp has been mistaken for with marijuana, but yeah, there's only 30 countries in the world who are producing industrial hemp, and it is also a very small industry. And right now, China is like the biggest industrial hemp producer in the world, and most brands have to rely on China's hemp for many reasons. But would you say, so let's get back to, I want to get back to the aesthetics of worn clothing and what that has to do with linen. Let's talk about repairs and fades, broken linen. I'm interested in broken linen, actually. Tell me about broken linen.
Yeah. So broken linen is something that I think we think about a lot in our design process. So when we are thinking about designing a thing, we try to imagine, and we have to imagine, what it will be like in 5 years, in 10 years. What will happen to what we have as a new material as it's broken, so being worn by the body, conforming to the body. I think obviously the best example of talking about breaking in something is like breaking in a shoe, where it fights you, and then all of a sudden it's the shape of your foot and it feels amazing. It's your shoe in some fundamental way. And that does happen. I mean, leather goods is the best example, but it happens also with linen in
Mm.
a more subtle, but is just as a compelling way. So when we are designing, I think we think about like when when especially when we're feeling the new fabric, we're like, how when we have to imagine how will this break based on our experience of wearing linen over multiple years. Will this feel better? Will this start to fray? Will this start to form holes? And so it's this kind of it's a really important design exercise that we engage in where we think about how an object is going to decline, and that we think about the decline as part of the original design. And there's like, and we think about, we found resonance in other forms of creating like garden design, where you really think about what happens in the winter when
Mm.
you have dead or dry plants, and how do you make your garden beautiful even when they're dead and dry.
Yeah.
Uh, and that kind of design thinking where you have to engage in this imaginary world of what will happen, how will it happen, but it's not just like fanciful imagining. It's often based on a certain experience. There's some scientific data that can come to play in making smarter evaluations. So it's like a reasoned form of imagination,
Mm.
but it's so important. And I think that's also one of these ways in which like the food and the textile analogies diverge because of the temporal thing. Like food is going to last as long as your meal. A good piece of clothing is going to last longer than you.
Yeah.
And how do we responsibly design for not just the whole lifespan of the garment, but the lifespan of the wearer as well?
Mm. Yeah, fascinating. Yeah, it's definitely like I'm sure most of our listeners, you know, are drawn to this aspect of our niche kind of corner of the garment industry where we do consider um, the almost like we design things to be passed down from generation to generation. Whereas like we nowadays we live in a culture where clothes are not, clothes don't represent that anymore. And also like digging through vintage, it's harder and harder to find good vintage nowadays because the things are just, we get to a certain point, like maybe like from the early 2000s where things just started to go to the shithole. And like,
Yes.
yeah, things are just made in awful fabrics and constructed in the most awful way, not thought through in terms of design. And yeah, I hope that, especially this year, people will start to take stock of what they own and how they consume, and why design is such an important aspect of life, even if you're not a creative person.
Oh, yeah. But I think it's also worth acknowledging that's really hard.
Mm.
And the cards are stacked against us.
Mm.
Um, I think in general, I see a sort of inverse flow of responsibility with least responsibility on the end consumer.
Mm.
Um,
Totally.
so many people, when it comes to everything from what should I have in my closet to recycling, puts a huge amount of burden and shame on themselves. But really, the economy is often pre-constructed for them, and your
Yeah.
options as an end consumer are so limited. You
Yeah.
can't, like in the United States, and this very well might be true in Bangkok as well, you can't go to the grocery store and leave without buying plastic that will probably never be recycled. You just can't do
Yeah.
it. Uh,
Yeah, it's
and
impossible.
it's impossible. And that isn't a failure of you as an individual. And I feel all too often it ends in the kind of like confessional, self abusive politics of like, I should
Yeah.
be doing more. but really, like I'm saying, it's like a cascading of responsibility going the other direction. So
Absolutely.
if we think about ourselves in as designers, we have a degree higher responsibility to make objects we want to see in the world, to provide them to our retailers and our retailers to the end consumer. But we also have a certain amount of our hands tied too when, like we're talking, when you go back down the supply chain, eventually you might run into the Chinese conglomerates who are producing hemp in a completely opaque way. It might
Yes.
be fine, it might not be fine. And we are not our own hemp producers. We simply aren't. So we can, in some way, we, more than the end consumer, can exert pressure on things like our suppliers, but only to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And the responsibility actually does land with the people farther down the supply chain, people who are going as far back as selling the seed for the cotton that eventually becomes the fast fashion, or selling the refined petrol that eventually becomes polyester. And that is probably, it's a complicated interconnection of how does industry relate to the state, relate to international trade, and that the conversation about probably how we get out of this situation involves a lot more policy, a lot more diplomacy than I feel like the conversation often gets to.
Yeah. I feel like, especially in American politics, but this is the case for politics all over the world, that lobbyists are way too far involved in politics, and that, you know, what used to be policy that was made to be protecting and serving people, the people, is now being created to protect and serve corporation, which is.
So part of me is like, we can't quite deal with how to have a responsible closet yet. We need to have a responsible politics and economy. And so whenever I feel caught in these systems, I'm like, okay, how can I fight back against that? And often it is like, in the American context, writing a letter to a politician. Like one of the big things that happens in the American political cycle is something called the Farm Bill, where they set the subsidies for what can and can't, what will the government will help grow or won't help grow in America. So you know, writing to your senator to encourage some form of, say, growing of cotton not in desert climates, for example. So there's a lot of
That would be
cultivation
a good one,
of
because cotton takes a shitload of water to grow.
one of the most, and for example, Arizona and Texas, who are desert climates, are the largest producers in the United States.
Incredible.
And yeah, so and they were, you know, that was built out because they have ample room, and you need a lot of space for industrial cotton, but there's long-term environmental impacts on that. But a lot of that can, you know, while I believe that a lot of these systems have really seemingly intractable momentums, I'm always encouraged by looking at world history and seeing how quickly things actually do change.
Yes.
Whether it's not like Winston Churchill being born at the height of the British Empire, and by the time he dies, it's pretty much just England.
Yeah.
One lifetime, and an entire world order has been shifted. So I don't think any of this is impossible, but I think it always requires framing it within the right level of abstraction and generality. And when we talk about, like, how can we live better, just us in our daily lives, it often means having to change the corruption and the problems downstream in incredibly complicated supply chain.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think definitely a sense of responsibility needs to be placed on all of us as individuals, you know, and not kind of outsourcing that responsibility to, you know, other entities to make change or make better decisions or push for, betterness. I think, and I also really appreciated how you brought in the context of how fast change can happen within human history, because I think for a lot of people right now, it can feel very overwhelming I feel like 2020 has been a very overwhelming year for so many people who feel very helpless by the political system, the medical system, by the larger powers that are. I think we definitely can and need to individually make small impact on every kind of level of that chain, whether you work in, let's say the cotton industry, if you work in a factory, if you, just so many different levels. If you are a small business owner, if you work in a corporation, just every single person needs to be taking responsibility for that. And there's definitely hope because, I feel like every single generation becomes a little more wise or a little more, I have a lot of hope for Gen Z. I think Gen Z are proving to be a very compassionate generation. Statistically, they have an incredible way of relating and having empathy. And, I'm in Thailand right now. The pro-democracy movement is being led by Gen Zers, who are definitely very bilingual, very mature and emotionally mature for their young age, young university age right now, pushing for change, relating to each other. There is like so much hope, don't drown people, don't fall into holes. There is good in the universe for sure, if we just all kind of make the best that we can of it.
Well, and I do generally believe in the strength of the human spirit to change their conditions for the better. But I often I temper that with this sort of belief that conditions have to be right. And there's a certain amount of chance and just good timing that also comes into social change. It could be something as simple as the story of Rosa Parks in the US being the right person at the right time to take on segregation on the buses, and then segregation in a bigger way, which had been going on for decades, and you could say it's been going on for centuries. So there's this sometimes sort of unexpected but wonderful meeting of the right time, the right place, and the right person, mixed with having already had the right intentions ready to take action when all those pieces come together.
Absolutely.
So I think the bigger thing for people who want to be active or activist on whatever degree of that spectrum you happen to be is also a degree of patience that comes with that hope, waiting for the moments to be right where the conditions really can change. Because it's not always when there's a will, there's a way, but our world is so big and dynamic and changing that often that way will present itself in unexpected ways, or I should say at unexpected times.
Wow. Yeah. Well, from going from linen to the history of textiles and the aesthetics of worn clothing to in the industrialization of raw materials to politics to philosophy. This was a wonderful little podcast, Alexander Robbins. Thank you so much.
It was indeed. I really enjoyed it.
And Alice
we sadly didn't get to talk about. We didn't get to talk about archery, which we had talked about before the podcast. But
you'll have to come back on. Yeah, you'll definitely have to come back on to talk about archery, because that is another fascinating little topic, friends out there. But I look forward to that conversation. But for folks out there who want to check out Blue Made, how can they do that?
They can always go to our website, and it's www.blluemade.com. Don't forget that second L. And then we're most active on Instagram out of all the social media. So that's at BlueMade with 2 L's again on Instagram. So yeah, come check us out. And we're always down to talk about sustainability and textiles, and we can get as nerdy as anybody wants to be.
Hell yeah. Well, thanks, Alex. Bye, everybody.